Well, hey, we've started something new, and if you weren't with us on Sunday, you missed the first message on the Gospel of Matthew. And if you thought that you had escaped the Old Testament and genealogies and long lists of names, think again. The book of Matthew starts off with a genealogy, but at this point, hopefully we've learned to appreciate the fact that God's always trying to teach us something through the genealogies, and this genealogy in particular has so much stuff. Now, we'd actually talked about it back in December, so we didn't spend a ton of time digging into too many details, but let me just recap for you some of the highlights. In fact, we can really see most of what we talked about just in verse 1. It says, "The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Well, what we're learning about is the gospel. This is actually the next chronological book after the book of Nehemiah. So even though Nehemiah is found in the middle of your Old Testament, it is actually the last historical book chronologically of the Old Testament. And so there's this gap of time, and then we get to the Gospel of Matthew. If you want to hear a real brief breakdown of the history, you'll have to go back and actually watch the sermon, because I don't know how to summarize it any more than I did there. But here in Matthew, we pick up with the hope that had never really been fulfilled in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, we heard about the good old days of the times of David. Nehemiah was trying to structure the worship patterns and the way Jerusalem functioned as a city after the times when David was king, looking forward to a Davidic Messiah who never came until we get to the Gospel of Matthew and we read the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David. This is all about the new work that God is going to do in Jesus. But it's not disconnected from the rest of the story. In fact, that's the whole point of the genealogy, is to show us that this new work, genealogy is just the Genesis, so it takes us all the way back to the beginning. This new Genesis, as it were, that is going to happen in Jesus is very much connected to and a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Jesus, you'll recall, means Yahweh saves. It's the Greek transliteration from the Hebrew Yeshua or Joshua. And that's really important because it's all about, the Gospel of Matthew is all about how Jesus saves. Jesus is Yahweh incarnate, and he is saving us. Saving us from what? Well, he's saving us from sin. He came to save, verse 21 tells us, we'll look at that on Sunday. Verse 21 tells us he came to save his people from their sins. Throughout the Old Testament, there's a persistent and pervasive problem, and the problem is sin. You see, we have all these stories where God saves his people from external problems, enemies, great armies, natural problems, plagues, famines. They march through the Red Sea. They march through fiery furnaces. That God is amazing in showing his people how he is greater than any enemy they might face. But sin is that persistent and pervasive problem because sin drives a wedge in between God and his people. And it actually takes what would be friendship between God and his people and it turns it into animosity. And that's the one problem that the people can't seem to get right, and it's the biggest problem. The biggest problem is when God is against you. Well, in Jesus, God has become flesh, and he's coming to save. He is coming to restore that which was broken, to mend and to heal, to save his people from the consequence of their sins. He's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He is the anointed prophet, priest, and king. The idea of the son of David is that the promises that have been made to David that a son of his would reign on the throne forever and ever. This is that son. The promise to Abraham is also in mind here because Jesus is the son of Abraham. Well, what promises in particular were made to Abraham? There were promises made particularly to the offspring of Abraham, but it seems that Matthew might be reminding us here of the very thing he's going to conclude with. That there was a promise made to Abraham that God would use Abraham to make him a blessing to all nations. You can go back to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 3 and read about it there. Well, through Abraham, all the nations are going to be blessed. That blessing is going to come through Jesus. And we see hints of the fact that this is not only the completion of one nation's story, it's not only the climax of the story of the people of Israel, this is good news for all people everywhere. We see that in the mentioning of the women in the genealogy. An odd thing to bring up in an ancient genealogy, but all the same, very significant here. We have Tamar, and we have Rahab, and we have Ruth, and we have Bathsheba, who are mentioned here, all Gentiles. None of them are from the genealogical, none of them are genealogically connected to the people of Israel, and yet they are in the genealogy of Jesus because they have been grafted in. And this is the hope of the gospel, that Jesus is not only the Savior of a particular nation, but He is the subject of the good news that is to be preached to all people everywhere. Namely, that God extends forgiveness for sins and that He's paid the debt Himself. He has saved us through Jesus for all who believe and will have faith in Him. And so if you've never done that, I want to encourage you, reach out to us. We want to share the gospel more fully with you. In fact, maybe we can even put a link to one of the videos we've made describing the gospel so that you can better understand what that's about. And if you know what the gospel is, if you know who Jesus is, I want to encourage you, do what my grandmother told me that she always does when she gets a book. Go ahead and jump to the end and realize what we're supposed to do with this good news. We're supposed to go and make disciples of all nations. This is not to be an exclusive message that we hide under a bushel. We'll read about that later on in the Gospel of Matthew as well. It is to be a light that we allow to shine. When was the last time you shared the good news of the gospel with somebody? I hope it hasn't been that long. Look for and pray for opportunities to share the good news of Jesus. I'm so thankful that Matthew was inspired by God to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that will be the subject of our study for quite a few weeks to come. I hope you'll be here to join us, whether that's online or in person here on campus. Take care.